But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. Love your enemies. Do good to those that hate you, bless them even as they curse you, pray for them even as they abuse you. It is a difficult message to hear and even more of a difficult message to follow. But this is what it means to follow Jesus. Notice I didn't say this is what it means to be a Christian. I offer this as a distinction between what Jesus has asked of his followers and what some that proclaim themselves to be his followers do in his name. They do not love their enemies. They do not offer the other cheek. They do not do unto others as they would have done unto themselves. So what has happened to the message of Jesus? Today we mark All Souls Day. This is a day dedicated to the memory of those who have died, those who have passed from this life and who we now seek to remember. It is a solemn day, an occasion for many to gather to houses of worship to ponder the meaning of life and death, and it is an old tradition. 267 years ago, for example, people across Europe were doing just this, gathering on All Saints' Day, which is the day after All Souls' Day, November 1st. It was a day like any other holy day. People entering churches, people offering their prayers up to God. But on November 1st, 1755, in Lisbon, Portugal, there also was an earthquake. It was estimated to be about 7.7 on the Richter scale. People rushed out of buildings to find safety in open places. Some made their way down to the docks, to the harbor, and there they saw a strange sight. The water was receding, exposing lost cargo and old shipwrecks. And soon afterwards, the water rushed back in, a tidal wave that swept away many people. And there would be two more tidal waves, a total of 3. And then there was a fire. No one knows how the fire started, but it burned over much of the city. Lisbon was not the only site damaged, with Spain and Portugal suffering many casualties. By some estimates, 50,000 people were killed by the earthquake, the flooding, the fires, and it was truly a tragedy. That long ago set of historical events had a wide and enduring effect on our lives right now. That day shaped the very way that we think. And how might that be? Europe at that time was in the midst of the so-called Age of Enlightenment. This was a time of scientific revolution, but also of great philosophical change. Some Enlightenment thinkers had for a century been disputing the enormous power and influence of religion over the minds of people. You see, the lives of people were ordered around the church calendar. You went to church on All Souls' Day, All Saints' Day. You went to church every Sunday. You followed the dictates of Christianity, whether that was Catholicism or Anglicanism, Lutheranism or Calvinism, depending upon where you happened to be. And one of the reasons for doing so was because righteous people of God were said to be protected and given blessings from God. These various religions had fought long wars over what that meant and who got to decide what it meant. But these divergent traditions did not diverge in their belief that God would protect his own. But then Lisbon was destroyed. Many people died, rich and poor, young and old, high and low. People died in churches. There are some accounts of people fleeing to the red light district of the city, where the brothels and other houses of ill repute were left unscathed. I think that's a bit more dramatic editorializing than it is historical integrity, but the breadth of the tragedy could not be easily dismissed. Well, 4 years later, in 1759, François-Marie Arouet, more popularly known as Voltaire, published a work of satire called Candide. This book and Voltaire's other writings helped to change the way that we think. It was a shift towards reason and away from religion. Candide is the story of a young man of the same name, a wide-eyed boy of innocent intelligence and optimistic outlook. Candide lived in a German castle in Westphalia. There he learned optimism at the knee of his mentor, the pseudo-philosopher Pangloss. Now, Pangloss argued that the world is just as it should be. All things were created with purpose, and that would be for the best of all possible purposes. For example, legs were clearly designed for wearing stockings, and thus we wear stockings. And he caps off these often bizarre arguments with the pronouncement that everything is perfectly right. But even that's not enough. It's not enough of a declaration. Everything is not only right, everything is for the best. From the moment of this rosy conclusion, everything falls apart. Candide suffers a book-long series of misfortunes. He is forced into the army, the invading Bulgarian army, but then is suddenly arrested for the heinous crime of going out for a walk. The military authorities appeal to his sense of free will, and they ask Candide whether he would prefer to be flogged 36 times or shot merely twice. Candide eventually flees to Holland. And there he meets up again with his former mentor Pangloss, also now removed of the castle, which had been torched by the Bulgarians. Pangloss had entered into a new role in this best of all possible worlds. He was a crippled beggar on the streets. Yet Pangloss did not give up his optimistic philosophy, even as he goes to greater and greater lengths to justify them and to say that this is the best of all possible worlds. Now, Pangloss is a caricature. He's a thinly veiled description of another philosopher, Gottfried Leibniz. And this represents Voltaire's disdain for optimistic philosophies, the effort to try to reconcile reason with a traditional sense of faith. And these efforts, though, have to contend with the age-old question about human suffering. This is Voltaire's project. If God is all good, all wise, and all powerful, how can evil in any form exist in this world? Now, the optimists, the optimistic philosophers, explain that God is good and the world is therefore good. Our free will is what can lead us to human suffering. But even that is good. Suffering incites human beings to strive to be better. And by this logic, there is evil in the world, but there is just enough evil to help human beings blossom toward their highest potential. Now, Voltaire was criticizing and lampooning these answers because he thought that the measure of suffering was far too great, such as in the great Lisbon earthquake of 1755. Now, theologically, Voltaire was a deist. That is a religious perspective that emphasizes human reason, not in deference to faith, but having faith be shaped by reason. The deists argue the notion that God is the creator, and does not therefore involve himself in the affairs of the world, whether that's earthquakes or otherwise. Neither the evil nor the good, neither the deliverance we receive or the disasters we suffer, none of those are placed at the feet of God. And while the optimist philosophers call this the best of all possible worlds, these deists, these rational deists, saw the world as the Creator's gift, an ongoing gift filled with natural forces and human progress. How then do we explain the presence of Jesus in the world? Well, in our gospel reading this morning, Jesus paints his best of all possible worlds, one in which we not only love one another, but that we turn away from violence, from hating each other, even as others may hate us. And this was a profoundly radical way of approaching life. It still is. Which leads to the question, do we believe that the lessons of Jesus are the right way to be living our lives now, right now, today and every day? Is that what we believe? Now, the first Unitarians, they were Christian in their theology, but they were more like the deists in their radical theological conclusions, some of them. For Unitarians, the Bible had to be understood within a framework of reason, an attitude that was as familiar to the writings of Voltaire as they were to fellow deist Thomas Jefferson. But what about God's involvement in the world? If God is intimately controlling the ways of our lives and the winds of our fate, then the nature of God's concern for us, positive or negative, should come up as it did for these philosophical optimists. This is a maximized world. But then there's Voltaire's counterargument. Would the best of all possible worlds include suffering like wars and earthquakes and calamities? And if suffering is to make people better, how do we explain when that suffering affects people who seem to be good? For the optimist, free will lead us towards suffering. Misguided ideas like false prophets, they will lead us away from righteousness. And our suffering then presses us back towards right thinking. It is a loop of logic that justifies a revolving door of human misery. For Unitarians and deists, free will is an exercise of reason. Reason as an intellectual ability that provides the means for understanding both the will of God and the ways of the world. And neither would contend that this is the best of all possible worlds. It is the world as it is, as it was created. Its state of being, its possibilities for goodness, and the actuality of some badness are the consequences of our human responses to the ways of the world. God, in this sense, is our lighthouse, not our ringmaster. One of my favorite research studies looked at the effects of optimism and pessimism on our understanding of the world and how we might predict the outcome of daily events. And this study found that pessimists are far more often correct in predicting worldly outcomes, better informed, better prepared, one might say. Conversely, another study suggests that optimists are happier and live longer. I once heard someone criticize it as saying that the pessimists just didn't want to be around the optimists for any longer than they had to. But placing that aside, the fundamental vision we have about life does guide our decisions. It colors our perceptions. Whether those are rose-colored glasses or gray skies above, how we look at the world matters for how we approach our lives. Which leads us back to Jesus. The lesson this morning leans into that brighter outlook, even if Jesus assumes that others might hate us or even strike us on the cheek. It's not exactly optimism, but it isn't self-delusion. It is a discipline for engaging with the world without anger or violence, without hatred or greed. That doesn't mean that those negative qualities will not exist, but they will not exist among those who choose to follow Jesus. Voltaire wrote another story. This one was about a genie that carried him away to a vision in the desert. In the desert, there were piles of bones. And those bones came from all of the people who had died during religious struggles, religious wars. The many men and women killed on the pages of the Old Testament, enemies killed in the name of God or in the name of obedience to those who act in God's name. Heretics, Protestant or Catholic, or merely those who were fighting yet another religious war. And near to these piles of bones, there were piles of gold, the wealth of those fallen, which was the spoils of war for those who raised their swords in the name of God. Now nearby, Voltaire spied some sad-looking men. These men, like Socrates and Pythagoras, they had sought to teach reason, virtue, science in the world. Men who had decided that no God would demand such a sacrifice of our reason or our lives by the sword. Voltaire then moves on and he sees another man. This man has wounded hands and wounded feet, a prophet who died at the hands of hypocrites, false prophets offering false promises. Voltaire sees the suffering of this man and his unjust treatment. He asks the wounded sage, what was the true religion that he had sought to teach? And it was the simplest of messages: love God and love one another. Voltaire never names the man, but it is not exactly a deep mystery. He then ends the story of Candide ambiguously, but I think we can also figure out what Voltaire was trying to say here. Candide and Pangloss and all the other survivors of the story's twists and turns, they end up living on a farm outside of Istanbul. Candide had survived a firing squad, a tempest, a shipwreck, an earthquake, the Inquisition, and a dozen other misadventures. And even after all of this, Pangloss, the optimist, concludes that if Candide had not been through all of those horrible adventures, Candide would not be there quietly eating pistachios. And Candide responds, "Excellently observed, but we must now cultivate our garden." For Voltaire, the garden was this world, the gift from God to his children, a gift like the teachings of Jesus and the simple but terribly challenging wisdom represented by the command to love each other. A gift like the dawn of this day, like the chance to reach out in the world to do good, even through all of the hardship and all of the suffering. Now, an optimist might say that this is the best of all possible situations to be in, while the pessimist might say that that is a pretty hard hand of cards to play. And Jesus would say, "Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." And that is his gift to us, a small gift of light from a true prophet in a weary world. Amen.